Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Strong Stoic podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Tumblin. Before I introduce my guest, I must announce that this podcast is part of the Walled Garden Podcast Network, which is a curation of podcasts of similar tone, similar quality, similar thinkers like myself, all pursuing, truth and wisdom and all kinds of interesting wisdom-like things. So please consider checking out the Walled Garden. I'm a founding member, director, contributor, and philosopher there because I believe in their mission. And eventually soon, actually pretty soon, I'll be doing my mentoring only through there. So no longer through Patreon, but actually through the Walled Garden. Also consider checking out my Patreon. Just if you would like to support me there, just myself, that would be greatly appreciated. You can find me there with Brandon Tumblin. Also check out the Telegram group chat. Get involved in the discussion. Would love to see you there. And finally, you can find all my blog posts at the Stoic Gym and on Medium. Okay, today I have the privilege of speaking with Todd Leader. Todd is a social worker and community psychologist. He's spent his over 20-year career leading service development and transformation, particularly in the areas of mental health, addictions, health promotions, and primary health care. Now, this is Todd's third time on the podcast, and this one takes a somewhat different direction than the previous two. In this episode, we talk about one of the most shocking, for lack of a better word, personal stories that I've ever heard, which is actually Todd's personal story, something he went through in the previous years. And there's definitely some potentially triggering content in this episode, including mental health struggles, so please prepare for that. Just full disclaimer here. And I'll also ask that you listen to the story with compassion for everyone involved. As I always say, as one of the lessons that I've taken to heart from Solzhenitsyn, things are complicated and we have to be very careful before we label people as simply oppressor or oppressed. Human beings are far more complicated than a binary system. So please just listen to this with compassion and understanding, and try and understand what the truth of the situation is. And as always, try and extract the lessons for what they are. Lessons that we can all take to improve our lives. Without further ado, please welcome Todd Leader. That's my intro music. Cool.
Well, I was hoping to get to sing, but whatever. You're going to use your own intro music. It's fine.
Go for it. Actually, I had people ask me if that was me singing. Like, I might be a bit of a narcissist, but no, not enough to start the intro with me singing. But
God.
It kind of does sound like me, I guess. But anyways, Todd, welcome back to your third time on the Strong Stoic.
Good to be here.
Happy to have you. I think we have perhaps a more difficult topic this time around, but we're going to get into it. So I'm going to let you start by actually first I should mention that this is predominantly based around a personal experience from your personal life. So this isn't, previously we've done talks on leadership, and the first one we did was on. What was the first one we did on? Do you remember?
Various mental health kinds of topics. Around mental health issues.
Right. But this is actually more of a personal story, and then we're going to try and extract some lessons from this. So I'm going to let you get into it. Basically, what happened?
Well, about 6 years ago, I was on a medication for restless leg syndrome. It's not called that anymore. It's now recognized as a disease. But the drug is called pramipexole. It's a dopamine agonist. It boosts dopamine in the brain. It's a Parkinson's drug primarily, but it's used secondarily for restless leg syndrome. And so I had been on that for a period of time. And along the way, people started to point out to me that I was behaving inappropriately, that I was communicating inappropriately mostly. And I saw nothing in what they were saying. It made no sense to me whatsoever. It turns out that pramipexole in particular, unlike lots of other dopamine agonists, it is known in the scientific literature and in case law. It's known to cause a few key things, key changes in a person. One, it causes disinhibition. And so disinhibition is like the inability to see or recognize where the line is between appropriate and inappropriate, and an inability to pay attention to it even if you do recognize it. So that's disinhibition. That's one of the things. Impulse control disorders. So that really means if the thought crosses your mind, you act on it. There's just nothing to stop that impulse from kind of thoughts turning into actions. And compulsive behavior. And so that's similar to somebody, for instance, with an obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive tendencies come from this medication. And so that really means the inability to stop performing a certain behavior. That's what compulsions are. So I ended up with people reacting oddly to me, in my mind, and starting to make complaints about me to various people and organizations, professional complaints. I had friends and colleagues start to show signs that they were offended by me and insulted and hurt by me, and some of those people went to formal complaints with regulatory bodies, professional regulatory bodies, and with the university that I teach at as well, because I was engaging in inappropriate messaging type of communication with people. So in one case, there was a student in a class who I ended up texting and messaging and supporting through mental health challenges when I shouldn't have been, because that's an inappropriate role for me too, as a faculty member. Getting involved and even trying to support somebody with their mental health is actually a scope issue, a scope of practice issue. But with that student and with a number of other people, a former student in another province, a colleague in another province, another former student, the list goes on, all female. In all those cases, I developed this compulsive tendency to be messaging constantly, and on every platform, every forum there was, I would keep messaging, and some of it was just odd, rambling kind of communication, but mixed in with it as well was sexually inappropriate type of commentary, innuendo, humor. Inferences, and the medication. I mean, I didn't know any of this at the time, but pramipexole, the areas where it causes that disinhibition and impulse control problems and compulsive behavior, the two main areas that in the literature and the case studies are in areas of sexuality and money. And so the other thing that I did during that period of time, there's about a 1 year period where the bulk of the most notable stuff was, I gave away over $12,000 to a former student whose family was struggling a little bit while she was in university.
Wow.
And it was like 100 different impulses in a sense, because I'd get a text, she'd say something about something that she needed and whatever, and I would just e-transfer the money. And I had bills to pay, and I was just throwing this money away like it was nothing, and it amounted to over $12,000 in the run of a year. So there are a number, and my communication, my messaging represented the compulsivity, of just sort of endless, to the point of two different people actually talking about laying charges for harassment, and they would have been completely appropriate in doing so. That would have been an accurate characterization of it, because there's no question my behavior fit that definition. And in some cases, it included that sexual innuendo and sexual type of humor in the messaging, and so of course that would also constitute sexual harassment of some of these people. I during that period of time, I can honestly say I looked at every single woman in a sexual way. Every woman, didn't matter age or size or anything, and not children, and not, I mean, woman, but it was just, that's just the way I saw them during that time. And so my thinking was kind of always in that area. And anyway, so I ended up with these formal complaints and various disciplinary actions, from employers and regulatory bodies. And the result, though, before all of that got settled, was after several complaints had been filed, 4, 5, 6, something like that, I had reached a point where I had no explanation for this. I just knew that all these different people, it wasn't like it was just one person, he said, she said kind of a thing. All these people, these different people in some cases who I really cared about, they were important people to me. But because they were continually pointing to me and kind of basically saying, you're being inappropriate, you're sexually harassing, you're hurting me, basically. Because of that, and I couldn't figure out why, I was not going to live as that kind of person. I've spent my whole life trying to be a good person, and I'm not saying I've never hurt anybody or pissed anyone off, or of course I have. But I've spent my life trying to be a good person. I dedicated my career to trying to do good in the world, that kind of thing. So I wasn't going to live as a dirty old man. I was going to live as some creepy predator. I wasn't going to live being seen that way or behaving that way. And so I had a suicide attempt, and that's just 4 years ago. And then it was an incomplete suicide attempt, but the next week my determination had risen significantly, and I happened to have family around, and they took me to the hospital for a second time, basically, and they ordered an urgent medication review with an outpatient psychiatrist. I got a cancellation slot 3 days later, and after an hour and a half of an assessment with a nurse and a psychiatrist, he concluded that the problem, this whole change in me, because my wife describes it as me being a different person. She uses that terminology. And anyway, this psychiatrist said, here's the problem. It's pramipexole. Because it does cause these changes in people. It does cause them to lose that ability to monitor and control their behavior and control their impulses. And I happened to be on another medication at the time, just an antidepressant. I've had depression my whole life. That's kind of no big deal in a sense. But I was on another one that also boosts dopamine, and his theory, which he then tested and successfully, was that one was boosting those same side effects. Anyway, he started weaning me off the medication, and 2 weeks into a 6-week weaning process, I had about 80%, my own guess, about 80% of my control back. And I remember sitting in a hotel room in Calgary, because I was traveling the country speaking and consulting on mental health system reform, and I remember sitting in a hotel room, and the evenings were always the worst in terms of this compulsive behavior, because that's when I took the medications for the restless leg syndrome. And so that was when they peaked. And I was sitting in this hotel room in Calgary at a conference, and I remember suddenly, it's like a light bulb went on in my head as I realized I don't feel the need to message anybody. And it's a moment I'll never forget. I can still see the hotel room. It's that vivid, because it was just such a dramatic discovery all of a sudden that I didn't feel that need. Anyway, so over the next additional 4 weeks or so, I was weaned off of the rest of the medication, two medications, but pramipexole being the main one. And I was back. My wife, at one point in one of our conversations, because she was, she really struggled through this time because she didn't really know who I was. That's the way she would describe it. But at one point, not long after coming off of the medication, she was on the phone with somebody or something, and she said, "My toddy's back." And it was one of those moments where I don't know, it was just this incredible great relief. And for me, it was a relief in relation to my identity, because it really, it made me question, or I guess all along as this stuff was unfolding, it made me question, is it possible that I am this kind of person? Like I mean, I have no explanation for it. I just know that I'm hurting these people and offending people and being crude. And so where's that coming from? Because I didn't think that was who I was. And I was convinced that I wasn't. And anyway, so that's the basic story. Some of the fallout of that in terms of the regulatory bodies and one of the regulatory bodies, the College of Social Workers in Nova Scotia, actually recognized. They actually sent me for an independent medical exam with a psychiatrist who they contracted, and that psychiatrist was absolutely certain, absolutely clear and unequivocal that it's pramipexole that caused this behavior. He even made a statement, and this is an interesting one for our philosophical discussion, but he even made a statement that was really clear that said, Mr. Leader can't be held accountable for or held responsible for the behaviors that are the subject of these complaints because of the medication being the cause, right? Because it's just so well established in the research. Anyway, so but there's there are other fallout with other organizations that did actually happen, where their organizations felt the need or the responsibility to make sure that they issued punishment, and despite the fact that in total there were 3 psychiatrists who all concluded the same thing, that the behavior was caused by the medication. Now, I'm not claiming, just to be really clear up front, I'm not claiming that therefore I did nothing wrong, because I absolutely did. I was offensive. I was inappropriate and offensive during that time. I've got lots of record of that. My memory comes and goes with it, but I spoke at a conference in Toronto during that time, and normally I get good reviews when I speak at conferences. But in this case, a couple of weeks later, I got an email from the CEO of the organization that hosted it, and an attachment. And the attachment showed some of the participants' comments, and 2 of the words that were mixed into those comments were vulgar and misogynistic. And I have no memory of what I said that could have possibly led to somebody writing those words about me, but obviously I did. And but I wouldn't have noticed at the time, because disinhibition keeps you from being able to recognize that you're crossing those lines. And so that's obviously what happened in that case as well. So anyway, so the list goes on, the list of examples of things that I did, and places and people that I hurt and offended goes on and on. And so I've, since then, as I've said, I'm not claiming at all to have not done wrong, because all of it was completely inappropriate. I find it disgusting, and I've been living with shame for 5 years now, because it's almost 5 years since this started to be discovered, since my behavior started to be pointed to as inappropriate, and I've discovered that shame is a dark thing. It's a dark thing that never really goes away. It's not like embarrassment or guilt. It's a different thing than that, and the shame that I feel is actually, for me, is shame over the fact that I hurt people. Because it goes against who I've always thought I was as a person. And if you had asked me, we just talked about this a few minutes ago, if you had asked me 5.5 years ago, would I be capable of communicating in those inappropriate ways with people and causing them to be uncomfortable and offended, and I would have said, no, that's not who I am. Because it's part of my identity to not be that kind of person. Anyway, that's the basic story. I started writing a book about it a few years ago, and I had to push pause on it because emotionally I actually wasn't capable of writing the details of things that I had said and people I had hurt. And so I'll be getting back to that at some point soon to be able to really get into more detail on the lessons in it for me and others, because there are issues of stigma that we may get into today. There's a whole pile of stuff, and that's not even counting the most basic piece, which is the lesson about medication. And so the piece that I'll throw in there about the medication is, just to get that practical lesson out there, is that, when we get new medications, we tend to look for symptoms and things like side effects that might be like, I don't know, may cause nausea or diarrhea or may cause a rash, and so we look for those things. But any psychological stuff, it tends to be a vague kind of statement, may cause mood changes. We'll see that type of terminology, and we tend to kind of skim past that stuff because we're looking for the rashes and the nausea and the diarrhea, and we tend to skim past it, and we don't watch for those things. If I had been aware, which I was not made aware of the nature of these side effects for that medication, but if I had been, I would have had a conversation with my wife to say, you have to watch for this because I won't know if that's happening to me. Yeah. So that's the practical lesson. I always have to get that thrown in there. The practical lesson is be specific in asking about psychological side effects, and if there are any, get the people in your life, your friends and family, get them to watch for those because you may not know that they're happening. So anyway, I'll stop there and now we can get into conversation about what all that represents.
It's when you first told me the story, it really, really just blew my mind, and it also fascinated me because I knew that there's a lot of lessons that we could take from this, and you and I have spoken about it a bit. So we've touched on some of those, but one of the things that's really interesting to me is that, as you go through life, you have these waves of self-discovery where you recognize your insufficiency as a human, right? So it might be something like, I don't know, you're a teenager and you're rude to your mom because, hey, she's just your mom, she's not important. And then you reach your 20s and you start to realize, actually, I was being like a huge asshole back then, right? And so that's like this self-discovery. Now, at the time, you didn't know that. At the time, it was completely out of your conscience whether or not your actions at that point was a bad action. But then upon growing as an individual and through reflection, you actually find that, actually, no, it was a bad thing. That's just an obvious example, but we go through these periods of thinking that we're so innocent and we're so perfect and we're getting better, and then something happens that puts our own insufficiency within our conscious view. Sometimes, optimally, it's from someone who cares about us because they can put it in a good way. Hey, listen, honey, I know you didn't mean anything by it, but when we were at dinner earlier and you said it came off a little offensive. And then, so maybe next time try wording it a little differently. This sort of natural, oh crap, that wasn't I wasn't even thinking about that. Now it's part of my consciousness. But with that comes what you spoke about, a little bit of shame. Yeah. So in a natural progression, what you have is you have these waves of self-discovery and then a bit of shame that comes with that because you recognize that, oh crap, I was screwing up for the last 20 years or 30 years. But then you have an opportunity for redemption where you can change your behavior, and then you sort of go through these naturally over time. What's fascinating about your situation is that because of the medication, it's not exactly this linear, like this path that's kind of on the way up. What ended up happening was you found yourself, you were sort of picked up and placed in a situation that you had no idea where you were anymore. And so you form, as you grow older, you sort of form this idea of your identity and who you are through these self-discoveries. And I know you've been with your wife for a long time. That's really important, having someone that can be a mirror to you. But then to all of a sudden go through a phase where, oh crap, actually, I don't know who I am anymore. And then the extent or the extreme of that is exactly what happened, where you get suicidal, and then you start thinking, like, that's the extreme. So you have these little ego deaths throughout time, but as long as they're measured and they're not too extreme, you can psychologically recover from it.
Yeah.
If it's, oh my God, I was a sexual predator for the last 3 months and I had no idea of my behavior, and that's not who you want to be, that comes with shame that is equivalent. Well, it's shame that can force you or make you consider something like suicide.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. What's your comments on that?
Oh, I think that's I agree with that, and certainly the way I would describe my experience with life generally, as as someone who is generally a self-reflective kind of person, I've had many of what you call ego deaths. Many of them, because I've made many mistakes. I've discovered many things about myself. So I've had lots of that in my life. This kind of smaller bits of self-discovery of, oh, that's not really consistent with who I think I am, and so I need to change that. And as you said, the beauty of being married now 33 years, the beauty of that is, of course, we are mirrors for each other, and so I've had plenty of feedback over that time.
I'm sure you have.
Absolutely, and it's all been good, even if it's not good,
Right.
because it does allow us to self-correct, as we go along. And of course, there's also the socio-cultural, socio-historical piece of things, in that times change as we age as well, right? So, what's acceptable or not acceptable in society gradually shifts and changes, and so we need to adjust to that. So there's self-correction that happens there, of course, and there are millions of examples of those. Of course, that's easy. This was different. This was a crash into a brick wall type of, like, how is it possible that I could have ended up becoming this kind of person for however long, and it just before the diagnosis, if you can imagine that feeling before that, when there's no answer, there's no explanation, and without an explanation, that means somehow this is who I am. And I don't know how you would view that, but I viewed that as unacceptable. I'm not going to be that person. So if that's who I am in any way, then I'm not staying here. And the diagnosis changed everything. Once that came, it at least there was an explanation. And for me, in terms of my sense of who I am, I was able to sort of partly restore my own sort of self-perception, and excuse me, partly restore my self-perception, because there was this external cause for this variation from who I had been, and this apparent sort of appearance of a different person than who I had been up until that point. And somehow having that external answer, that external cause, on a personal level, that was a relief. Because I got to go, oh my God, thank God it wasn't just who I am. Getting the diagnosis helped to restore my sense of who I was in a way that was consistent with who I thought I was and who I had tried to be my whole life. But it didn't, and this is 5 years ago. There's nothing that has eliminated the shame, because once you've hurt people, once you've been offensive to people, once you've made people uncomfortable who you shouldn't have made uncomfortable, whether that's because of professional boundaries being crossed, whether that's because of saying things to people you care about, colleagues, friends, etc. The shame part never goes away. That's, at least for me, but I think that that's part of the nature of shame.
Yeah.
It's just my own observation.
Well, I would say that I'm just trying to think of an equivalent that people could understand, and I think the closest that I can come up with is alcohol. So many, especially in our culture, there's a heavy drinking culture here. But if you've ever been out drinking with your friends and you get moody for some reason, maybe you get angry, maybe you even get like really emotional and you kind of break down, maybe you cry about something that's going on in your life, and sort of like this out of character uh, action that you're taking while you're drunk. And then, oh, the camera's gone. We'll just do audio then. Um, but so you basically have these, you wake up the next day and you have all these memories of the things that you've done that night. Now, if you've done things that are embarrassing, including things like getting angry, making an ass of yourself, essentially, that's a very hard thing to deal with. So now you have the physical hangover, which sucks, but now you also have this psychological thing, which is, holy crap, like I just embarrassed myself all night. Now, what's interesting about it is you can justify, well, I was drunk. Mm-hmm. It was the alcohol. And fair enough. It was the alcohol. However, that doesn't mean you escape the shame of the experience. That doesn't mean that you just get to, wash it aside. It's not that simple, right? And so what I would leading in this discussion into now is every single person is not necessarily the potential that they have, right? So there's a wide spectrum of potential that we all have as individuals. This is a very crucial understanding in philosophy and in Stoicism. Like if you're in a traffic jam, yes, you can get angry. You can also not get angry and play some music. Like those are two options. You have the potential to do both. Most of us have the potential to do both. But what you choose to act on is what ultimately matters. And so if you choose to not get angry and not flip the person off, that's a virtuous choice. But you have to recognize that you have the potential to have road rage, probably.
Yeah.
That's probably why you're into Stoicism in the first place, right? You have the potential to be an a-hole on the road, essentially. But just because you have the potential to do it doesn't mean that that's what you are, for one. Okay, so I'd be interested to know, I guess, how you think about this in terms of, because it's easy to say, well, this person, when they're drunk, it's just that's just their true self coming out. But if they're not normally like that, if they normally have the capacity to be angry, but they exercise to kind of calm themselves down, they meditate, they work on themselves, they do the breathing exercises that you have to do sometimes when you start to feel angry. If you're normally doing that person and then alcohol brings out an angry outburst every now and then, is that really who you are? Or is it the potential of who you are and you're choosing actively not to be that person? I don't know. I'm interested to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah. And I've heard that kind of phrase lots of times over the years, that when we drink, it just allows us to be honest, about things that we normally wouldn't be honest about. So that comes from the fact that one of the first symptoms, one of the first effects of alcohol is that it causes disinhibition. Yeah. So disinhibition, same thing. Same as I said before. It's more than just keeping things in that are trying to get out, like thoughts or whatever, because it does involve a certain level of inability to recognize where that line is between appropriate and inappropriate, and then a level of inability to stop from crossing it. Now, just take this to an extreme. People have tried to use intoxication as a defense in court with really serious crimes.
Correct, yeah.
And so there's a limit somewhere there. There's a limit because, think about it. Regardless of how drunk you get, you could be completely incoherent. Is it possible that you would reach a point where you didn't still know that killing somebody was wrong? that's a bit absurd. It's so extreme, right? So, but is it possible that you would lose the understanding that urinating on the sidewalk is unacceptable? Absolutely. So there is an issue of degree here when it comes to that, and our ability to still know that there's a line and to know where it is. And I think that we have to recognize that disinhibition, if chemically induced, so that's what we're talking about in the example and my own case, if chemically induced, then we're talking about a change in the neurology of the brain, and the brain is what determines those things, our ability to stay attached to the socialization that we've been raised with, and the laws of the land and all of those things. And so if that line gets blurred chemically for us, then we're going to see behaviors that are uncharacteristic. So does that mean that those behaviors are part of who we are? I'm not sure. I mean, does that mean you're somebody who really has always wanted to urinate on the sidewalk, and from now on, as long as nobody's looking, you're going to? It doesn't. Yeah. It just doesn't. It means that while under the influence of that neurochemical agent, you're more likely to do that.
No, absolutely. And I want to tie this in with something that you said earlier, which was one of the symptoms where there's no in between thought and action. Was it the compulsive?
Impulse control.
Impulse control, yeah. So this is interesting to me because you cannot actually control your thoughts. This is a weird area in philosophy, but when people say you can control your thoughts, which they do say in Stoicism, what they mean is that you can control the thoughts you have afterwards, or you can consciously choose to have a certain perspective on a certain thing. What they don't mean is that you have complete control over your thoughts. And I argue with people about this all the time, and I say, well, if you think your thoughts are completely in your control, how long can you sit still and think nothing? Or how long can you sit still and think one thing? Like, you can't. There's thoughts coming in and going all the time. We have these that come out of seemingly nowhere. Now, some of those thoughts are going to be good. Some of those thoughts are going to be not so good. Some of those are going to be neutral. But where the decision making comes in, what I would argue where character comes into play, is not receiving those thoughts, but it's processing them, having the perspective on those thoughts, and then choosing the appropriate action afterwards. So when you have something like this impulse
control disorder,
impulse control disorder, when you have that, you don't get that in between. What you get is the thought, and then it immediately goes to the action. So the whole self-reflection, the whole ethical dilemma that you have to go through, generally speaking, in life, you don't have that.
Exactly. Combine that with disinhibition is really like you've got no screen there to keep anything from happening. If I suddenly had this picture of the Jim Carrey movie, Liar, Liar.
I love it.
Because just whatever, as soon as it crossed his mind, it came out.
Yes.
There was no in between. There's no filter there. There's no step where there's, this thought, then there's the consideration of where that fits in terms of this appropriateness concept, and then there's a choice. There was none of that. There was no choice. It just, the thought turns into an action. Yeah. And that was the nature of what I went through in terms of my messaging of people, because my compulsive behavior was messaging. So that's what the compulsive part was. And so whatever thoughts crossed my mind, I would type them on my phone or in some platform. I was messaging people to death. And there was there was whatever I thought came out, kind of just not so much out of my mouth, but out of my thumbs, but it's the same thing. It's just that just happens to have been the behavior that was the problem for me. but with no filter in between, no
Correct.
pause.
I'm going to use an example. Sorry to interrupt.
No.
But it just, how many times, this is a question for the audience, I suppose. How many times have you started texting something to someone, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh shit, this is going to come off wrong, or this is not the right way to say this. This is going to be offensive, and then you use that infamous backspace, and then you rephrase the response or the question, or you say it a different way. How many times have you typed up an email in reply, and you're a little pissed off by whatever the situation is, and then you say, actually, this is not the right way to do it. So you hit that backspace.
Yeah. Or you leave it sitting in your drafts until the next day because you think, oh, I better not send this while I'm mad.
Yeah. So this is important because it gets back to the potential thing. That's both of you in a sense. You're the person who wrote the nice, kind email replying in a professional way, and you're the person that wanted to write that terrible email. You are and you're not. That's the breadth of I would say, potential as a human being. Now, again, ultimately, it gets down to what you choose to act on. Which of those emails do you choose to send?
Yeah.
Right?
So imagine if you had no backspace, no delete button, and no drafts folder to keep it in until tomorrow. Imagine if you had none of those, so that as soon as you typed a letter or a word, it sent.
Yeah.
And it just kept sending them sequentially as you typed them.
I'd have no friends.
And no job.
No.
And no, absolutely. But think about, what, so that's really, because that's what this experience was like. This, and so who was that? Was that me? Because it came out unfiltered and uncontrolled because of this medication, or am I the person who would have been present to push pause and to push backspace? Mm-hmm. Like which one are you as a person? Any of the listeners, which one are you? Are you the person who impulsively started to type, I can't believe you're saying this, you jerk, to your boss? Is it you or something to your partner? Or is that you, or are you the person who pushes backspace and saves the email to tomorrow, or are you both?
Yeah.
And so there is this identity issue that's been part of what I've been struggling with because of this, because really, this whole thing led me to this question: who am I? And the answer to that question, though, was the determinant of my decision to not want to live.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Because the original answer to it was, I must be this creepy old guy who's hurting people.
Yeah.
Because I don't have an explanation for the behavior, other than the fact that I'm the one who's been doing this to people, and there are people who have been made uncomfortable and hurt in various ways, emotionally because of this, and I did it, so therefore that must be me. But when I got the explanation, it was kind of like I then became the person who has the backspace button back again. So I like to think that that's who I am.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating identity kind of dilemma that this whole thing creates.
It really, to me, I think that the fundamental question that this raises is, are you all the good that you've done, or are you all the bad that you've done, even in the situation where you have done something bad and you knew it was bad at the time? It's an interesting question. Are you the worst thing you've ever done? And I don't think you are. I don't think anyone is the worst thing that they've ever done. I also don't think everyone is the best thing they've ever done. I think we're all just deeply flawed individuals somewhere on that spectrum of virtue and vice. And the ego death that comes along with realizing that actually I'm not all virtue. I do have a few things to work out. In your case, because of the medication, it was different. It was an odd situation. it wasn't, again, a natural progression of ego death. But like, we tend to categorize people as, you've done something terrible, therefore you're a terrible person. I've read about psychologists who have gone into prisons and spoken with people, and even some philosophers, and they'll go into these prisons where essentially murderers, right? Like, just heinous crimes. But they'll do things with them, like they'll play basketball, or they'll have like these creative situations, and they're like, you would never even think that they could have committed that crime.
Mm.
And now obviously they should stay in prison. Obviously they did the crime. But are they just the murderer? Are they just the person that was playing dominoes during that prison visit? Are, like, who actually are they? And it's a really, really deep philosophical question.
Yeah. Yeah, and interesting, I think for all of us, we would be, well, I would argue for most people, most of your listeners probably, and if we were to conclude that we are the worst thing we've ever done, most of us would feel pretty disheartened over that.
Yeah.
Because we know the mistakes we've made in life, and the people we've hurt, and whether as adolescents with our parents, or with, we know of all kinds of things that we really aren't proud of, and so that's a terrible way of thinking. It's not a comfortable way of thinking, for sure. But it's also naive to think that we are the best thing we've done. Like, we're
Correct.
just the sum of the good things we've done.
It's too innocent. Yeah.
It's just, well, yeah, it makes no sense logically. We are the sum of all of it in some way. And I think that our real identity, I think it comes from how we manage and respond to those various good and bad things we've done. Are we learning from them? Are we self-correcting our behavior, our communication, our relationships? Are we self-correcting as we learn things, so that we're trying to do more of the virtuous stuff because we learn that, oh, this thing that I'm doing is actually, it makes those people happy, so maybe I'll do that more? Are we trying to do less of the negative stuff because we've learned, oh, when I say it that way, it tends to hurt my wife's feelings, so I won't say it that way anymore. And but this whole experience and our conversations earlier also lead me to think about this issue of how we judge people, and based on their behaviors. And so in social psychology, we talk about attributions. So we make attributions about the cause of other people's behaviors. We also make attributions about the cause of our own behaviors. And one of the biases that is commonly known is called the fundamental attribution error. And what that is that we tend to make more of what are called internal attributions about other people's behavior than we do external attributions. So an internal attribution means, I see you behave a certain way, or I hear you say something a certain way, and I decide, not consciously really, but I decide that that the reason for that behavior is something about your character, your personality, who you are. It's something internal to you that caused it. And the external, of course, is that there's something in the circumstances of your life at that moment, or more globally, or something like, so in my case, an external factor would be the medication being put into my body and affecting the brain. That's an external factor. And so an external attribution is attributing someone's behavior to some circumstantial kind of factor. And we tend to use internal attributions about other people's behavior more because we don't know much about their external circumstances. And so in the absence of information, we go with what we have, and what we have is just, I know that it's you that did it, therefore you're a jerk.
Yeah.
But if I understood more about what made you who you are, about circumstances that were surrounding you at that moment when you said or did that, if I understood more about that, I would tend to make a different kind of attribution, somewhere along that continuum, kind of, that would be more external.
Yeah.
Just because I have that information. And this is a piece of where stigma comes from around mental illness. That is that stigma essentially is attributing somebody's behaviors that might be related to their illness, attributing them to their character, essentially. And so someone is behaving, irrationally or maybe crudely or rudely or in some way, then we just see them as a bad person in some way. We judge them that way. And that is part of what this issue, it's, stigma is really judging somebody for having the symptoms of a disease or an illness or something of that effect. And that is that kind of internal attribution piece of things.
Yeah. My one of my close friends put it this way, which was really interesting. He said, we make generous assumptions with children all the time when, you have a 5-year-old and they freak out over something and they miss the mark. They do something that's not good. They freak out, they get angry. But you're very generous with them. You say, "Oh, but they're just a kid." Right? Now, parents, I think particularly mothers have this on average, probably a bit more, but they tend to see their children not as they are, but they see them for the potential of who they could be, right?
Yeah.
This is a very beautiful sentiment, and I know my mother embodied this just more than anyone from my perspective, and I'm sure that's not true. I'm a little biased in that, but she told me once that I could never be a bad person. And I'm sure she knows that I know I've said things as a teenager to her that were rude. I know I've snapped at her. I know I've been a bad person to her. But she doesn't see that. She sees the person I could be. She sees my potential. She sees this guy's just he's just a kid. He's growing up. He's got more to learn. Yeah. Now we make the mistake of thinking that learning stops at 18. And I think it goes on right until you die. I think you're constantly missing the mark. And I think, within reason, but I think we have to be somewhat generous with people in our assumptions about them that, before you assume that they're just a terrible person, maybe take a minute and think about, well, who could they be? Who could they be? What's the potential of this person? And are they that one angry outburst, or are they that one bad thing that they did at 10, at 20, at 50, at 60? We're all just flawed, deeply flawed individuals trying to find something like a state of flourishing. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a parent's tendency for sure. I think that's incredibly common among parents, and sometimes naively so. I've got a number of teachers in my family, and so they tell stories anonymously, of course, but they tell stories of interactions with parents sometimes where parents are sort of at this point of naivety that they won't even accept that there are imperfections in their own child, and that yes, little Johnny actually did do that to little Mark, and so there's this denial and other things because of that tendency to want to see what this person could be, or perhaps even in some cases it might be a should be. I'm not sure, but I completely agree. We tend to do that with kids, but we certainly don't do that with adults.
No,
I don't think. You mentioned earlier the cancel culture.
Yeah.
Well, what is that? That concept that's out there right now. I think it's kind of like a one strike and you're out kind of approach in life.
Yeah.
You do one bad thing, whether within your control or outside of your control, doesn't matter. Whether there are external circumstances or it's driven from internal kind of character or forces, Doesn't matter. It's just, here's the behavior. You're canceled.
Yeah.
And everybody piles on. That's just sort of the nature of it. And if that's where we're heading, if that's the approach we take, where we don't consider circumstances and context and potential for good and bad, as you talk about, and the fact that we're all kind of learning as we go, if that's where we're heading, we're all going to have a problem. We're gonna all be canceled. It'll be just like a game of elimination, and there'll only be one left.
Yeah.
It's like I don't know if you remember the old movie Highlander.
Yeah.
There can only be one, and so this is where it gets really tricky when we take that kind of approach, because we fail to understand so many aspects of what real life really is, and we attribute particularly everybody's bad behaviors to a character flaw, to them being a bad person.
Yeah.
And there's no way to kind of undo that in a culture of social media. It just grows so quickly that there's no way to turn it back. There's no rewind on this, socially speaking.
Yeah, for sure. I think the whole cancel culture is, there's nothing less stoic than cancel culture. The Stoics would say if you get offended by something, you should question why you are feeling that way, right? You should reflect upon that, and maybe it ends up being something that is offensive. Then the question is, well, how do I deal with this in a pro-social manner to affect a positive change? Which normally it's not canceling them.
Yeah.
Right. So even if you are offended, and if it's something that's worth being offended about, the Stoics would still say, fight the injustice, but try not to get too offended by it, because it's going to cloud your reason.
Oh yes.
Control the emotion. It's hard when you're sort of overwhelmed by that feeling of being offended, to actually have a conversation that's going to enact a positive change in someone.
Yeah. I saw a video by Ricky Gervais on TikTok, and he says it was something like, he said, I've got 8 million followers on Twitter, and I get these people. I'll tweet something, and somebody will respond as if I meant it about them individually. I've got 8 million followers. I have no idea who you are. He said it's like going to the town square and putting up a sign that says guitar lessons, call this number, and then somebody walking up to it and going, I don't want guitar lessons. How dare you? And they tear the number off, and they call you and say, are you offering guitar lessons? And you say, yes. Well, I don't want guitar lessons. That's the absurdity of some of this, right? Is that we jump to that offense at everything too quickly. But having said that, I don't want that to be interpreted as me making light of the way I offended people during that, because I don't ever take that for granted. I will go to my deathbed with the shame from that, and and the embarrassment at having treated people that deserved better in that way. But I was asked during a formal meeting related to one of the complaints that took place. I was asked the question, so what are you going to do differently in future to make sure this doesn't happen again? And I said, well, I'm going to keep paying attention to professional boundaries, like I always did, for decades before. There's a long history of that, but mostly I'm going to not take pramipexole. Yeah. That's really the only answer there was in that case, because that was the factor that caused that particular thing. But it was interesting that people thought that question made sense to ask.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it was clear where this came from. So why ask what I'm going to do differently? I'm going to not take that particular medication or any that boost dopamine. But we still want to look to the person as having, as being the problem. it's you that's the problem.
Yeah.
It's not circumstances that led to behaviors.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about maybe just briefly how
Yep.
a Stoic would view that situation. So they would view it as, again, you have your thoughts coming in, but you have no control over which you act on because you're impulsive. But I guess the simplest way I could put it is they would argue that you have no rational faculty. You've lost your rational faculty, which means in the Stoic sense, you've lost your divine mind. You've lost the mind that nature has embodied upon you to be a human being, to reason. And that's what you use when you have, again, when you're sending a text and then you have to hit the backspace. That's your reason coming in. So your emotion comes in because you're pissed off about something and you start typing this dirty text, and then your reason comes in and says, actually, this isn't the best way to do this. This isn't pro-social. This isn't Stoic. Let me hit that backspace and type it a different way. That's your faculty of reason. And so without that, you can actually act virtuously. From the Stoic perspective, that's their opinion on the matter, is that without the ability to reason, you can't actually be virtuous, and thus you can't actually flourish. You can't actually be happy. You can't actually. So, and this raises a whole lot of questions about, you talk about like mental health, and you talk about like, people that have actual neurological disorders or brain disorders or psychological disorders, I suppose we could say, probably the better way of saying it. But yeah, they would actually say that if you don't have certain faculties, you're not capable of really flourishing as an individual. And I think we know that, and that's why we intervene with certain, maybe we try out some drugs with someone to try and get things working properly, because we know that if your mind isn't working as nature intended it to, you cannot be a functioning human being. You cannot be happy. You cannot flourish.
Yeah, it's funny. That reminds me of the concept of competence. So we deem, like in courts, in all kinds of formal processes, we question whether a person is competent to to defend themselves, competent to stand trial, competent to make decisions for themselves in life. And that really is about that judgment as to whether they have that ability to reason in a conscious and intentional kind of way. Because if they have that, then yes, they're able to be in control of their own decisions and actions, and therefore able to be held accountable for them as well.
Correct.
But if they don't have that, if they've lost any of those aspects of reasoning that we would consider to be part of competence in the sort of the legal sense, then we see them very differently. So that's when you see people being found not criminally responsible for a particular crime. They may have committed it, and it might be on the record, and everybody knows, yes, absolutely, this person is the one who, whatever, stole that car or assaulted that person, but if they're not seen as having had the mental capacity to understand what they were doing, in other words, to reason in between the impulse and the behavior, right?
Yeah.
Then we deem them to be not criminally responsible. So yes, they're responsible for having done it, but no, we can't hold them accountable for it in a traditional sense.
Correct. Yeah.
Because they had no choice. Yeah. They didn't have the capacity to stop the behavior from happening in that case.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the outcome is or how severe it is, we still might take precautions to protect people from that person while we figure out if we can, give them back that reasoning capacity.
Right.
So we might put them in a psychiatric institution while we work with them, as opposed to a prison. But that's more about trying to restore them to being competent and safe for other people.
Yeah.
As opposed to punishing them.
Yeah.
Which is what prison does. We have, of course, some treatment and support kinds of things in some prisons and available to some extent, but that's not really, practically speaking, that's not really what they're there for. Yeah. And it's
it's we do that as well with children. I mean, it would be very. I'm trying to think the best word. Ignorant, rude, I suppose. There's a certain age. I think maybe it's 3 or 5, where children, they start to have the capacity to judge volume. So if you have 2 glasses of different shapes, and then you take one glass and you pour the water into the other glass, there's a certain age where children cannot distinguish that it's the same volume. They don't have that faculty. So, you could say, well, is the child stupid? And it's a dumb question. It's right.
The person asking it is.
The person asking it is, yes. It is. It's not a relevant question because they don't have the faculty to do that. They don't
Absolutely.
have that rational divine mind in the Stoic sense to actually reason through that particular situation.
Right.
And then you get into issues with mental health, and you get into issues where you have psychological effects from drugs that are outside of your control. And it gets really tangly because I think people, we know a child is a child and they're going to grow up. But when you see an adult that's supposed to be fully developed and you don't know, like, I'm not saying we as a species can't figure it out through science and things, but you as an individual looking at someone who did something in your mind that's crazy, you don't know. You don't know, was he intentional in that? Was it drugs? Was he drunk? Was it this? Was it that? You don't know. With a child, and so I think part of unpacking, I suppose, the stigma around some of this stuff is that understanding that when you're talking about, you cannot hold someone with a fully functioning or properly working brain to the same standard as someone who has lost that faculty or hasn't developed it yet.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and it was Jean Piaget that did all of that work on that. Was
right.
That principle of conservation, actually, and there are others that he did, like object permanence, and some of those. There are a few that were really about a child reaching a point where they have a different capacity to reason around certain properties, and but yeah, before that we don't wonder about it. We don't make an internal attribution about their failure to recognize that it's the same amount of liquid.
Yeah.
We don't make an internal attribution. We make an external attribution in the sense that it's just their age.
Yeah.
It's not because this child is unintelligent or has visual impairment we don't do that.
It's context.
It's absolutely, yeah. But with adults, it's harder, but it's harder also because we can't see what's going on in that person's life. None of the people that I was hurting and offending, none of them had any information, because I didn't have any information about this medication I was on. So what are they seeing, and what are they able to judge?
Yeah,
They're just seeing that this guy, this middle-aged man, is being creepy and inappropriate and perhaps excessively flirtatious and just the sexual innuendo in everything, and giving away a shitload of money. But they just see that kind of stuff happening. So what have they got? They've just got, well, it was taught.
Yeah.
That's it. There's no other context. Like with kids, we make an assumption of context.
Right. Yeah.
But with adults, we don't. We make an assumption of no context, and we go straight to that internal attribution. It's just that he's just this kind of person, obviously.
Yeah.
And we just didn't know it.
Right. Yeah.
One of the lessons that I've kind of come out of this experience with for other people that will end up in the book is really how do when you start to notice characterological and behavioral changes in somebody that you know reasonably well, and their behavior starts to drift somewhere that it normally wouldn't. What approach arguably should you take to your decisions or judgments about them? And what I would suggest is what we all need to be doing is when we start to see that, we should start to ask questions about what might be going wrong here, because there are lots of people who may be in a position, and in my case even may have been in a position, to have been able to help find an intervention earlier before more people were hurt and offended.
Yeah, right.
You know, the earlier someone around us catches it and says, look, there's something wrong here, Todd. We need to go see somebody and see if we can find out what it is. It may have prevented a suicide attempt. It may have prevented, tons of that stuff.
Further damage.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I believe we have an obligation to each other, except that we're not really made aware of. We're not educated on this and made aware of the fact that people, when their behavior starts to change, it may represent some type of mental illness. Might be medication, might not be, it doesn't matter, but there's something changing. We have an obligation to help them figure out what it is before all hell breaks loose in their life.
Yeah.
You know, and if you're the one noticing it, then I think you're the one who should be raising it as a topic, as a question.
Yeah.
And trying to find help. Otherwise, everybody stands back and just kind of watches self-destruction happen.
Yeah. And we spoke about this on the first episode we recorded together, where people's mental state changes based on things that happen in their life. It wavers. So if you lose a job, if you go through a breakup in a romantic relationship, if your dog dies, if this, if that, there's infinite number of situations that can happen to you in life. It's, there's probably going to be some change in your, certainly in your demeanor, certainly in how you are presenting yourself to the world. But so those things are worth considering into the equation. But if nothing's changed, if there's been no change, if no one's died recently, work is still tugging along, this and that, but all of a sudden there's this weird psychological change that's manifesting itself now. You really got to raise the question. But we still, I think, have this idea that, this naive idea that we're simply just this rational brain, which we're not. That's why Stoicism exists, is because we have to learn how to use that more through and stop the negative emotions as much as we can, but try and manifest the positive ones as well. But everything you do links back to an underlying motivation, which is based on something like an emotion. And we're not just the rational part of our brains.
Oh, absolutely not. We are, and there have been, in the history of psychology and certainly philosophy as well, there have been lots of ways of viewing this, the creation of who we are. What is it that causes us to be who we are? And, I think that most these days would conclude that we're the result of a combination of influences. And, and so to some extent, we are the result of simple genetics and epigenetics, the broader. So to some extent, we're that. But then we're also kind of like a pinball in a pinball machine. That's what life is. Life is just this whole thing, the whole process of these flappers, hitting us in different directions than we planned on going. And every time that happens, it does change us. And it might be microscopic one time, and it might be macroscopic another time, if that's a word. I hope that is.
Yeah, I think so, macroscopic, yeah.
And so, I've had lots of the microscopic ones, as we talked about earlier, the kind of the learning, the ego death things. And this one's macro for me. This was totally life altering, but it is that combination. It's more than just that, we're just these rational. I'm not even sure we are rational beings, but that's a whole other topic. But we certainly aren't just these rational beings who make decisions, and all of our behaviors are within our control. That simply makes no sense in a world where there are far too many factors, internal and external and otherwise, that directly affect or cause or prevent behaviors of various kinds, and thoughts even, and feelings, and they're all impacted by so many variables. when we're looking at other people, we really don't stop very often to say, I wonder why. Wonder why this person is experiencing that. I wonder what those broad factors and variables are.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. I think maybe, so we've spoken about this now for a little while, taking out some of the lessons. I think it's probably a good idea to end and to make sure that it's clear that, we have a tendency now to split people up into two groups. Either you're a victim or you're a perpetrator. You're oppressor or oppressed. I think these terms are foolish. I think they're naive. I think it's not a binary thing. It's not a dichotomy. We do need to absolutely acknowledge that, the people that you have affected throughout that experience, I mean, very valid. They are 100% victims in that situation.
Absolutely. And there are a couple that I can think of actually who I would consider probably to have experienced permanent effects, traumatic kinds of effects because of harassment on my part, the compulsivity that led to that. There are some others where I think it was more minor offense as opposed to damage, but there's a mix there for sure, and yeah, I certainly would not ever claim to be the victim in this case. I think I would claim to be the victim of the pharmaceutical side effects.
Correct.
Yes, but I am the person who hurt these other people and offended them. There's no way around that. There's no way to change that. Yeah, I guess I wish I had known at the time, but that still doesn't take away my accountability to those people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would, and because I think people think about this as a dichotomy, and it's not. Yeah. Victims can be victims, or sorry, that was a dumb way of saying it. You can be an oppressor and you can be oppressed. Yeah. You can just because you've done actions that make other people victims, you victimize other people, maybe is a better way of saying it. You could also be a victim as well, and it's not always a competition, right? Who's the more victimized? I mean, and again, that's not to say that those complaints aren't valid, and it's not to say that in some cases maybe justice can include something like punishment. It's these are very complicated, nuanced discussions, but I think we do ourselves a massive disservice by splitting people into oppressed and oppressive. And I'm gonna just say this quote, and I might get you to maybe reflect on it, and then I guess we'll come to a close. So this is a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was one of my historical heroes, and listeners of the podcast will be familiar with him, but I'll just give this quote here. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?
Yeah, well, that is clearly, making the point you just made, which is that we spend too much time really sorting people into good guys and bad guys in the world, and I think our whole world is doing that now with Russia, and so there are probably many people who are responding aggressively to anyone they meet who is of Russian descent. The same as there are many people who have been inappropriately aggressive with people of Chinese descent because of COVID and blaming them. But it really isn't that simple. It is the fact that I think we all try to be who we want to be, the kind of person we choose I think we do make conscious decisions, but the reality is that lots of circumstances, lots of the paths that we're on in life can go places we didn't imagine, and so we can end up doing things or being things that we never thought we could. And it's like I said, if you would ask me 6 years ago, could I have ever gone through this period of time, a period of months or a year and a half, whatever it turned out to be, could I have ever have gone through that period where I communicated with students and former students and female colleagues and others in ways that would offend and hurt them because of everything being just too sexual in nature? I would have said absolutely not. That's not who I am. Mm-hmm. But yet, one circumstance just changed the path, and lo and behold, here I am with having been that person that I would say I'm not. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so does that mean that we all have this capacity for good and bad in us? Just given the right circumstances, I suppose that's probably true. You've talked about different groups during wartime and the kinds of things people are capable of. There's been lots of psychological research, Stanley Milgram and others looking at what people are capable of under certain circumstances. And all those circumstances, an important piece for me is, as a social psychologist, all those circumstances are the things that allow us to make those external attributions and say, okay, well, yeah, this is the situation that kind of caused those behaviors. It's not just, well, let's just close our eyes and throw darts at this person and say it's because he or she is a bad person.
Yeah.
There's more to it than that, and we jump too quickly instead of taking the time to try to understand the circumstances involved, which are always complex, never simple.
Yeah. Things are always a lot more complicated than you probably think they are.
Absolutely.
I can tell you from an engineering perspective, and I can tell you from a philosophical perspective, things are always a lot more complicated than you think.
Yeah.
Thanks, Todd, for coming on. I know this wasn't an easy one. It touches to your heart. I think you stayed pretty rational through the whole thing and was able to extract some lessons out, and I appreciate it, because I think this is a really big learning experience, I know for you, but I think others can learn from this as well. As sometimes you just don't know where life's going to take you, right? And it's that's kind of what it is.
Yeah. So if you're going to do anything, take anything away from this, start with look up pramipexole and make sure that none of your loved ones end up on it.
Yeah.
That's the first.
Thanks again so much. Okay. We're going to end it there. Until next time.